I previously was the SNP Shadow Deputy Justice Minister between September 2004 and May 2007, and as such was responsible in particular for prisons. So I'm fortunate to have visited prisons in 4 countries and found very different patterns to which they work. In my own parliamentary constituency, right from the point I was elected, had Peterhead Prison, which was originally opened in 1888, a classic Victorian prison long overdue for replacement. Now we have the modern HMP Grampian serving very different purposes and much more of a local prison for a mixed prison population, including remand prisoners. It's worth making the point, I think, that this report, which is wide-ranging in its scope, makes many interesting and useful recommendations, is leading to this very useful debate. The thing I want to perhaps start on is the subject of statistics, which I think almost every contributor to the debate has made some comment on. I'll just make a few observations. In the 270-plus committee meetings of justice, which I have attended since being elected, it feels even more, presiding officer, sometimes. We've made visits to many different places, and one of them I remember in particular was a Monday visit to Glasgow Sheriff Court. I think there were 8 courts running in parallel. The court we were visiting was the weekend incarcerations. We had 59 appearances in the hour that we were in that court. And a fair number of them were ending up as remands. And you have to ask yourself the question, how much consideration therefore was given to the remand process when you're spending about a minute per case? And I think that's a good and valid question we should properly ask ourselves. Now, it is also worth making the point that my judgment, and that's all it is, but shared by, I think, by other members who were present at the time, is there wasn't a newcomer among the 59 people. They all knew the system, so I could see perhaps where the judge was coming from. But I think, let me focus in on that proportion of people who are subsequently convicted, having been remanded, but not imprisoned thereafter. I think that is the part of this issue that might most susceptibly, if studied in depth, give us information. Because I think if we were to look at a case where a judge decided, for whatever reason, that remand was the proper thing to do, part of that is presumably considering that imprisonment might be the ultimate end. We should look at that and see why there appears to be, what seems to me at least, a mismatch between the judgment made at remand and the ultimate outcome. And I think that might particularly inform us and perhaps the judicial system about their remand decisions. And I think that's an area where the government might consider getting an academic to look at an appropriate number of cases that fit that criteria in looking at what's going on. Now, also, the committee at paragraph 154 talks about what informs remand, and there's a whole series of things, but it does make the comment that decisions are usually made under significant time pressures. Well, I've seen that, and I think that's absolutely spot on. Similarly, it talks about there is some data and some courts have a tick list which at least records, and I think that could, as the committee recommends, be more widely done. In evidence, the Sheriff's Association talks about written reasons for refusal of bail are provided if an appeal is taken, but only then. And most of it's given orally. And having been in court and watched witnesses and accused hearing a quite rapid delivery of various oral things related to bail conditions and so on and so forth, it's perfectly clear that the person hearing it isn't absorbing it all. So I think there's actually a real danger of justice not being served by our not writing it down and making sure that the prisoner and the prisoner's lawyer is getting that so that they know exactly what is happening. I want to just, in the short time remaining to me, Presiding Officer, make a comment or two about health. The committee at paragraph 84 properly says when you put people on remand into prison, and that's their only experience of prison, that nonetheless leaves the mark of prison upon them and carries with it a considerable risk. And at paragraph 98, and here I'm going to pick at the words the committee has used, the committee considers procedures should be in place to ensure that, where appropriate, prisoners retain access to prescribed medication. I don't know what the where appropriate means. I would think there should be almost no occasion where prisoners should be denied access to the medication prescribed by a qualified practitioner from elsewhere. And there is reference in the government's response to the committee's report to the if the presiding officer permits.
Yes, I can allow that. Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would the member agree with me? I'm slightly concerned that a few years ago the government decided that NHS would take over health services in prisons. So does he share my concern that things don't seem to have become more seamless from provision outside prison to health provision in prison with that change?
Stewart Stevenson.
Well, certainly with the NHS supporting people in the community and in the prison, one might imagine that sharing data would be somewhat more easy than other arrangements might place. And I think that's certainly something that we should look at. But then I think there are general issues about data and medical data, which health professionals sometimes get in the way of doing. Briefly, Presiding Officer, the immediate needs referral, which has been piloted, it says, while there's no statutory obligation where local resources permit, establishments may extend this model to include those on remand. I encourage the government to act upon that worthy thought that they've said in their response. I've just taken an intervention on the NHS, and the whole issue is equally covered in the government's response. A very useful report, Presiding Officer. I can see that the government's listening. The Minister's making extensive notes. I'm sure she'll read the official report afterwards. I hope the Finance Secretary is also reading.